Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Great to see you here. Thanks for taking the time to join us for today's webinar about how climate change is making harmful algal blooms more toxic and what our Mississippi River states are doing to respond. We're really pleased to have three wonderful presenters today. We have Professor Christopher Gobler, we have Alicia Vasto, we have Matt Rota. I will do a more lengthy introduction of our great speakers in a couple minutes, but first off, wanted to take the opportunity to share a little bit more about the Mississippi River Network for those of you who may not be as familiar with us. MRN is a coalition of now nearly 70 organizations and businesses working together to protect the land, water, wildlife, and people of our greatest river, the Mississippi. Our network implements the only national public program of its kind for the river called One Mississippi, which is designed to educate, engage, and inspire people to take action to protect our Mississippi River. Since 2009, One Mississippi has recruited 20,000 river citizens and inspired thousands of actions. And actually, we will end today with a couple of opportunities that we have to inform actions related to what we're going to learn about today. So a few quick housekeeping items. As you can see, we are in our normal Zoom meeting mode, which means you can see the other participants that are here. You can engage in the chat. We just ask that you keep yourself muted as our presenters are speaking. And if you have questions, please ask them at any time in our chat box. For any members of the press who are present, if you could please identify yourself and your outlet when you ask a question in the chat. We'd love to prioritize some questions from you, our media colleagues. We are recording this webinar. You can find the public recording on our One Mississippi YouTube channel. I'll also make sure that the direct link to that YouTube video is shared with everyone who's registered. All right, we will run until the top of the hour and include some Q&A time at the very end. So after all three of our presenters have gone, we will go into a little bit of a Q&A. But as I said, feel free to ask questions at any time, and I will monitor the chat for that. So with that, I'm so grateful and really eager to learn from our three excellent speakers today. First, we will hear from Dr. Christopher Gobler. Dr. Gobler is a professor within the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at Stony Brook University. He's been the co-director for the Center for Clean Water Technology since 2015. The major research focus within his group is investigating how anthropogenic activities such as climate change, eutrophication, and the overharvesting of fisheries alters the natural biogeochemical and/or ecological functioning of coastal ecosystems. Professor Gobler will share his extensive research on the impact of climate change and harmful algal blooms, or HABs. And then after Professor Gobler, we will hear from Alicia Vasto, the Water Program Director at the Iowa Environmental Council and our co-chair of MRN's Policy Committee. Alicia will be speaking about nutrient pollution impacts in the state of Iowa, especially in light of the 10-year anniversary of Iowa's adoption of its nutrient reduction strategy in 2013. And then finally, I guess we're kind of following the river here. We'll learn from Matt Rota, the Senior Policy Director for Healthy Gulf. Matt oversees science and policy initiatives for Healthy Gulf. He and his team advocate for science-based policies and environmental enforcement that protect Gulf communities. So thank you to our three wonderful presenters. And I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Professor Gobler to share his screen.
Okay, well, thank you for the invite. Happy to be here and talk a little bit about harmful algal blooms and climate change. And I'm going to cover actually a lot of freshwater, mainly freshwater, but we'll touch on marine. So jump right into it here. So we know we live in a changing world, and scientists now like to use the term Anthropocene. We've heard of things like the Jurassic era, and so now we're in the Anthropocene. So that's the era where the activities of humans are the dominant influence on climate and the environment, overwhelming the forces of nature. And this is probably not news to anyone. We know that our global temperatures continue to increase, and in 2022, 2023, we've had some remarkable temperature trends. The warmest month ever occurred in July, and we just had the warmest summer ever on planet Earth. And if you look at the data here, and you look at where 2023 is, we would call this as scientists an outlier. And that is, not only was 2023 the warmest summer, it was the warmest summer by a lot. And that has other consequences for coastal ecosystems and inland water bodies. So, for example, we know that rising temperatures means oxygen levels get lower. And we know that across, firstly, the last several decades, that the ocean is undergoing what we call deoxygenation. And we know that areas that are hypoxic, that are areas that have very low levels of oxygen that are dangerous to aquatic life, have expanded, and there are hundreds of those areas documented now. Of course, the largest one in the U.S. is actually downstream of the Mississippi River. So, sure we all know this, but just as a reminder, the Mississippi River watershed is 2/3 of the U.S., goes all the way up to Canada, and that nitrogen loading from the Mississippi River leads to low oxygen zones in sometimes there's the dead zone in Gulf of Mexico. That's an area that has expanded over time, and we expect to expand further as we go through continued warming. Another symptom of climate change in marine systems, at least, is something we call ocean acidification. Our levels, the reason temperatures are going up is because the level of CO2 keep going up in the atmosphere. And that has consequences in the oceans of, as the CO2 levels go up, the pH of the ocean goes down. We won't talk about it much today, but that has important consequences for a lot of life, particularly in marine systems. And then the topic of the day are harmful algal blooms. I'm going to talk more about freshwater harmful algal blooms secondarily, but here just looking at marine harmful algal blooms, there's no doubt have expanded, and you can see the quote here. Their impacts have increased, and those impacts can be recreational, public health, tourism, fisheries, and aquaculture. And this just shows a few examples of maps of the way things used to be compared to where they are now, with two different types of marine harmful algal blooms shown here. And so when it comes to climate change, therefore, the one really important thing that I think about a lot, and I think more and more people are thinking about, is the fact that it's not just that temperatures are increasing, it's that those temperatures are actually happening with increased lower oxygen levels, so more hypoxic zones, acidification, and harmful algal blooms. And so one way to think about this is that I use sometimes is calling these things the four horsemen of the aquatic climate change apocalypse. So that we've got warming, hypoxia, acidification, and harmful algal blooms all happening concurrently. And the important thing is, with these things happening, how is that affecting aquatic life? And the bottom line is, actually, we don't know. There just haven't been enough studies done. This figure here just gives you a sense of how we think it may all be operating. But the bottom line is all these things are changing at once, and we don't know how it's going to impact, for example, fish and fisheries, or things that live on the bottom of our aquatic ecosystems. We can expect that, organisms in the water will be more affected by say, warming and harmful algal blooms. Those in the bottom may be more affected by harmful algal blooms and other things like low oxygen. But frankly, we just don't know. But we do know that climate change is also driving changes in the patterns of harmful algal blooms. One thing that we know is that in marine systems, and actually freshwater as well, as water's warm, and actually this goes for even on land, as the planet warms, organisms will start to move towards the poles to stay in what we call their thermal optimum. So in marine systems, an example of this that we've seen is a type of harmful algal bloom known as Alexandrium. This is what the cell looks like. We worry about it because it makes saxitoxin, and that's a neurotoxin that's actually 1,000 times more potent than cyanide and can get the cells and their toxin can get into shellfish and lead to something known as paralytic shellfish poisoning. And we've actually shown how ocean warming, not in the future, but that warming we've already experienced is changing these blooms. So as an example, here's the North Pacific, so North America, Europe, and what you're seeing here, this whole area in red and orange, are areas where, because of warming, since 1982, the ocean has extended the bloom season for this organism. It's got more time to grow. And so maybe we don't care about the open ocean, but just as an example, if we look at the northeast US and specifically this target area here, this is one of the areas that has warmed the most during the last several decades. You can see in some extent, the numbers here are days per year. So the bloom season, if over this time period have increased by 2 days per year over this multi-decadal period, you're looking at a bloom that could be going on for 2 months longer than it had previously in this particular zone. And when we actually look at some data from this water body here, the Bay of Fundy, what we see is what was predicted is actually happening. And that is we've got a 3-fold increase in the density of these organisms in the Bay of Fundy when we compare the 20th century to what's happening today. And again, that's likely due to it just being warmer and the organism having more time to grow. I'm going to transition now to talking about freshwater ecosystems, and specifically, they can be called blue-green algal blooms or cyanobacterial blooms. I'm in New York right now, and so this is a system that I work on sometimes. You can see this right here. It's called Lake Agawam, and it's right on the ocean. And so this is not a lawn, but this is what that lake looks like. But frankly, these are these sorts of events, as I'm sure you're all aware, happens all over the country, literally thousands of locations. And they're a serious issue. Something is serious when it's strong enough to take down an elephant. And in fact, this is a paper that just came out last year showing that in 2020, there was this in the national news, this unexplained event of elephants across the plains of Botswana and Africa dying off, hundreds of them, endangered elephants, in fact. And what was revealed is that there are seasonal water bodies that show up. There's the rainy season and they begin to evaporate. And as those ponds and lakes begin to evaporate and the volume goes down, the nutrient levels go up and these blooms get more intense and are responsible for the die-off of elephants. Furthermore, the CDC has demonstrated that over time, there's been hundreds of cases of dogs being poisoned by these cyanobacterial blooms. And you can just do a search for the news, and every summer there's some sort of event like this, unfortunately, in the US as well. And these events, like the ones in the marine system, are being affected by climate change. In some ways, exactly the same. In other ways, it could be different. But certainly, it's multifactorial. It's warmer water, it's changing in freshwater flow patterns, all of which can change the outcome and the intensity of these events. But just to give a quick example, my dear friend and colleague Hans Perl from University of North Carolina published this paper many years ago. And I love, of course, everyone could love the title, Blooms Like It Hot. And what essentially, if you boil down the data, it shows is that with cyanobacteria, the warmer it gets, the faster they grow. And while other types of algae may conk out as the water temperatures get higher, the warmer the better for a lot of these cyanobacteria. And a study by the EPA, or looking at an EPA data set of over 1,000 lakes all across the United States, boiled it down to essentially being able to show that the two biggest predictors of cyanobacterial biomass in these thousands of lakes was essentially either the amount of nitrogen in the lakes or the temperatures. And it was a positive relationship. So the warmer it gets, the more intense the cyanobacterial blooms would be. And so the biggest freshwater bodies, of course, in North America are the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes hold 20% of Earth's fresh water, and you're looking at them here. And amongst them, in the lower right here is Lake Erie. And Lake Erie is unique because it's the shallowest of these water bodies. It's also the one that's the most populated. And as you can just see here by the coloration, it's the most prone to these cyanobacterial blooms. And I'll just, as a reference point, because now I'm going to talk about the effects of temperature on these events, but as a shallow water body, it's the most likely to warm. The blooms tend to be the most intense in the western region of Lake Erie. And to date, that's been associated mainly with the fact that there's many tributaries entering in here, and those tributaries being a strong source of nutrients, particularly phosphorus. And in fact, it's the Maumee River here in the lower, in the southwest corner, that is the strongest source. And you can see these events get quite intense. And it's not just that they look bad, but in some cases it could be quite dangerous. So for example, in 2014, there was a scary situation where the entire city of Toledo had to shut down their water supply for almost a week because toxins from the organism that blooms in Lake Erie, Microcystis, got into the public water supply. And this is you can see here, this is the intake for the Toledo public water supply. So you know that if the surface waters look like this, that the water they're taking in could be in danger. And again, people had to be put on, have their own sources of drinking water because they couldn't use their own tap water at this time. And so the organism that forms blooms on Lake Erie is known as Microcystis. It's actually the most common cyanobacterial harmful algal bloom forming species on the planet. We was part of a group that did a review paper a few years back where we showed that these blooms occur in over 120 countries across the planet. And they're of concern because they can make this toxin known as microcystin. I'll note firstly that when this was first discovered, people tested it against mice. And the first name they had for microcystin was fast death factor because it was so lethal to mice. I'll also point out, if you look carefully at the molecule, I don't know if we have any organic chemists in the room, but you don't need to be a chemist to know that if you look, there are many nitrogen atoms within this molecule. Here I'm counting at least 7 or 8. And that has serious consequences because the more nitrogen this organism gets, the more toxin it can make. And again, you can see that there are many negative health outcomes associated with microcystin. So in Lake Erie, these microcystis blooms have gotten more intense over time. This is showing a decade ago, but it's a really relevant data set because what it shows is that actually at the turn of the century, these blooms were quite mild, but they really intensified through the first decade of the century, and they've only gotten more intense since then. So what I want to share now in my remaining time is a study that I recently have performed with some other collaborators, trying to answer the question, is this increase we've seen in microcystis bloom intensity related to changes in water temperatures in Lake Erie? And we've taken a somewhat unique approach to do this. So just very quickly, we've gotten data on the manner in which temperature affects growth rates of microcystis to come up with and use some statistical approaches to have temperature-dependent growth curves for microcystis. We've done some statistics with those to get best fits. And then in parallel, we've gotten a unique set of temperature data. So, when people think about measuring temperature in water bodies, it's typically get in the boat, drive out, and stick a device in the water body to make a measurement. Or alternatively, have a continuous monitoring device. And these are all very useful. But with some colleagues of mine, what we've discovered is that you can actually get kilometer by kilometer, day by day temperatures for any water body using satellite data. And so these are temperature records that are unprecedented. Because again, as I said, if you can get kilometer by kilometer and day by day, that's better than anything out there that humans are measuring in any water body. And so then we're taking that together, the temperature record and the growth response of microcystis, to do some statistics and understand how that's affecting microcystis blooms in Lake Erie. And so, this is, for what it's worth, what the temperature-dependent growth rate looks like for microcystis. And it's a lot like those curves I showed you before, with it peaking out somewhere in the high 20s to maybe almost 30 degrees centigrade. Now, this plot here is the warming trend in Lake Erie. And this is since 1995. And you can see, firstly, I'll just say this is a heat map. So the darker the shade of red, the more the warming. And then you'll see a bunch of black dots. Anywhere you see an area that has a black dot, it means the warming has been statistically significant. Right? It hasn't just changed, but significantly so. And so this image in itself says a lot, because it, one, says actually, since 1995, you can't find an area that hasn't been warming. Oh, and I need to pause and just say, this warming is seasonal. So we wanted to understand the warming in the bloom season of microcystis, so we considered June through October. And so you can't find a region of Lake Erie that hasn't warmed since 1995. And you can see for probably 80% of the lake, that warming trend has been statistically significant. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the western extreme of the lake, because there it's almost all significant, and the warming is probably double the rate that was seen for the rest of the lake. And that's probably because of the shallow nature there. But again, the goal wasn't just to understand how this affects the temperature trend, but the goal was to understand now, how does that relate to microcystis blooms? And so now I'm going to show you some of that data. And so this is just showing you the western portion of the Lake Erie. And what this is showing is the change in the rate at which microcystis can grow during the summer. In this case, it's since 2002. But what you're seeing, again, if you see something without a black dot, well, then there's no significant trend. But what you're actually seeing is that this trend is highly statistically significant. And you can see this, it's this area in the western region, the far western region, where they're growing. There's been the largest increase in the growth rate. And that's significant. Remember, this is where all the phosphorus is coming, this exact area, that's the Maumee River. And that's where their growth rates have increased the most. These temperature changes have also changed the seasonality of microcystis blooms. Another word for that can be the phenology, right? So phenology might be like, when do birds migrate? In this case, we tried to track the beginning and the end of what we called the bloom season. And we used the cutoff of 17 degrees centigrade to mark the bloom season. And what we show is that at the end of the bloom, timing hasn't changed too much, but there's been a significant increase in the start of the bloom season. So microcystis has had more days to form a bloom. And so when you put those two things together, this is the extension of the bloom season since 2002. And I note that this area here, this super hot spot, essentially is telling us that in some regions, right where the phosphorus is coming in, the bloom season has extended by more than a month, just this century alone. And if you wanted to see it year by year, this is how the growth rate has increased, and this is how the bloom season has increased over time. Certainly some wiggle, but also certainly faster growth and a longer bloom season today than we had at the in the 20th century. Very last thing I'm just going to point out is overlaid on top of the temperature trends are changes in the delivery of water from land to sea. And so this is NOAA data showing that essentially along the Mississippi River, you can see during the 20th century through 2012, there was a significant increase in the amount of heavy precipitation falling. And that's significant because when there's heavy precipitation, that's the type of pattern that's most likely to deliver nutrients into surface waters. And looking forward, people have done studies and essentially have predicted that in the future, not only have we already had more precipitation? That trend is expected to continue and to significantly increase the amount of nitrogen going from land into coastal water bodies. And to show that across the US, you can see here, this is what it's expected to look like by 2030. We're not too far away from, and what it's expected to look like by 2070. And you can see, again, right along the Mississippi River, lots of regions where because of more rainfall, there's going to be more nutrient delivery. And that's why people have done studies. You can see the title of this paper really says it all, that the record-setting blooms in Lake Erie are caused by meteorological trends and agricultural trends expected for future conditions. So it's both warming and the runoff of those nutrients. So to wrap up, I spoke of harmful algal blooms being the fourth of four horsemen of the aquatic climate change apocalypse. We don't know a lot about what happens when you've got climate change stressors and harmful algal blooms. I've showed you that increasing temperatures are intensifying microcystis blooms in Lake Erie, and that we expect that trend to only continue as we have more warming and more precipitation in the future. And I think because of that, we can say with some confidence that in the future, aquatic organisms are going to be more likely to be exposed to both harmful algal blooms and these climate change stressors. So I'll wrap it up there, and then once I'm all done, I'll be happy to have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Gobler. Very profound findings, and I think a great setting to go from looking at the freshwater systems to now two state examples of what is happening in a more local level. So Alicia, I will turn it over to you, please.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and harmful algae blooms here in Iowa. I have a lot to say on this topic, and I have a lot of slides, but I'll try to go through it quickly. I apologize if I'm rushing, but a lot of information, and thank you, Dr. Gobler, for setting the stage here for this conversation. So just briefly, I'd like to talk a little bit about water quality issues here in Iowa. As everyone knows, Iowa is a very big agricultural state, and most of our water quality problems come from agriculture. So primarily from fertilizers, commercial fertilizers, as well as manure that is applied as fertilizer, the nutrients that are in those fertilizers, nitrogen and phosphorus. And then we also have issues with bacteria contamination and sediment. And then, of course, climate change is exacerbating a lot of these issues as well. And that creates negative outcomes for Iowans here in the state. We have, health issues related to nitrate pollution, the harmful algae blooms that create cyanotoxins like microcystin and the bacteria and pathogens, and then those result in real financial costs for Iowans here, not to mention folks downstream in the Gulf, which I know Matt will talk about. But to create safe drinking water, we have to remove nitrate from our water. And then there are also costs associated with economic losses of impacts to tourism and recreation here in our state. And an environmental working group analysis, I believe last year or the year before, showed that medical expenses attributed to nitrate exposure were between $6.25 and $37.5 million annually for Iowans. And we know that we can expect more algae blooms as a result of climate change for all of the reasons that Dr. Gobler mentioned. The links between heat and increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and harmful algae blooms are, there's more and more research demonstrating this. And here in Iowa, we've seen in the last few years, it's been drier and hotter. I think especially in the last three or 4 years, we've been in a serious drought here in Iowa that hasn't been seen since 2012 here. And It's really having, I think, some really unexpected outcomes. People think of Iowa as usually dealing with a lot of flooding, but recently we've been very dry, and that has been leading to more algae blooms, as I'll talk about in a little bit. And then, of course, we have threats to our drinking water as well. Microcystin is really toxic in drinking water. There is no way to easily remove microcystin from drinking water. And we have some threats here in central Iowa with the Des Moines River. The Des Moines River has had microcystin identified for over the years, but in the last few years, it has been a real issue. And it is a major drinking water source for close to 600,000 central Iowans. So when the Des Moines River is contaminated with microcystins, we have to switch water sources. And with the drought, that has really put restrictions on other sources that we can draw from for our drinking water. So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with here, especially in central Iowa. So I want to talk a little bit about recreation here in Iowa and our Iowa Water Watch program. So Iowa isn't really known for our beaches, but we do have beaches and lake recreation here in the state. And it actually brings in $1 billion to Iowa's economy annually and creates thousands of jobs. So it is majorly important to especially a lot of rural communities that, you know, have lakes, and that draws people to visit them in the summer. And of course, water quality is by far the most important factor for visitors who are choosing a lake to visit. During the summer, we have some beach monitoring programs in the state. So the Iowa Department of Natural Resources monitors 39 state park beaches every summer between Memorial Day weekend and Labor Day weekend. And then the Army Corps of Engineers does the same monitoring protocols on 6 reservoir beaches here in Iowa. And they are monitoring for E. coli and microcystin, and then they issue beach advisories when there are exceedances of the safety thresholds in those 2 contaminants. Iowa Water Watch is a program of the Iowa Environmental Council that we started a few years ago to really try to raise awareness about the connections between recreation, public health, and local economies. And so we started tracking the beach advisories that were being issued by the DNR and the Army Corps. And so we've been trying to share that information with Iowans each week. During the summer, we sent out a weekly newsletter notifying folks about the advisories. And then we've been tracking them over the years to see, you know, what we can see. And so this is just the DNR advisories since 2006 for microcystin. In 2020, they changed the advisory threshold to be more protective. So prior to 2020, it was set at 20 micrograms per liter is when they would issue an advisory for microcystin. But since then, it has been 8 micrograms per liter. And so, you know, we see consistent microcystin advisories. If you're kind of wondering about some of this here in the middle, I have an explanation for that, and we can talk about that later if we want. But, you know, in recent years, we've seen very consistent microcystin advisories. And I just want to talk about one from this summer that was really the worst algae bloom that we've ever seen was at Brushy Creek. And that's in central Iowa, north central Iowa, north of the Des Moines Metro here. They had the worst algae bloom. They had 10 weeks worth of microcystin advisories this summer, which is the longest advisory period that we've seen for microcystin in all of the time that we've been tracking beach advisories. And prior to this year, Brushy Creek only had 2 microcystin advisories ever. So, you know, Brushy Creek is a tributary of the Des Moines River, which is, like I mentioned before, that drinking water source for central Iowans. So this was a really remarkable and pretty sad thing to see happen this summer. But it was, you know, we think because it was so dry this year. So how are we addressing these issues here in Iowa? Well, the main way is through the Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy. So the strategy, as Maisa mentioned, was adopted in 2013, and it was officially adopted as the state's official policy to address nutrient pollution in 2018. So the strategy is entirely voluntary for non-point sources of pollution, which in our state is primarily agriculture, and is the primary driver of nutrient pollution in our state. So we've been very critical of the strategy over the years, and because it is, voluntary and it has a lot of, you could read one of our many papers about it, about all the flaws with the nutrient reduction strategy. But this is, of course, the 10-year anniversary of this strategy. And so there's a lot of information being shared by agriculture groups about progress that's been made, and they share statistics about how we've seen a 650% increase in bioreactors and saturated buffers. We've seen 98% completion of phosphorus goals, and we're 100% committed to the nitrogen reduction goals. But this is some really misleading messaging about the strategy. And we really believe that the voluntary approach is not working and would be impossible to work at the scale that is necessary. So this is the data from the most recent updates on the nitrogen load leaving the state of Iowa. So you can see the blue is the annual load, and then the green is the 5-year moving average. So that helps to compensate for, years that are outliers with heavier or less precipitation. So you can see that the 5-year moving average really hasn't changed. And in recent years, the annual load has been down because the flow has been down. And you can see the same thing. We had a major drought in 2012. And then when rainfall returned to normal, we see a spike in the load that's leaving because all of that is being washed off the farmland and back into the rivers. And so then same with the phosphorus load, we really don't have any significant improvement in the actual water quality data that we're seeing here. So, another thing that we have seen is that this voluntary approach is really not working because even the market forces that you'd think would help lead to reduced nutrient inputs are not stopping the rise in fertilizer sales. Just last year, fertilizer sales were up, and this is, an adaptation to climate change and threats to yields is to apply more fertilizer to help prevent that being a hit to your productivity. So we created this website kind of in response to some of the messaging that we were seeing. We call it Iowa's Declining Decade, decliningdecade.org, and it has a bunch of information about the nutrient reduction strategy, the reports that we've done, and the recommendations that we've made to improve the strategy to actually make it effective for Iowa. So if you go to that website, you can find all of those resources there, but we're really trying to put into context what is necessary to actually see nutrient reductions and address issues like harmful algae blooms here in Iowa. So, when they're talking about increases in the numbers of bioreactors and saturated buffers, well, the reality is if you start off with 4, then you can really see a major increase year over year by just adding a few each year. And the cumulative acres that have been treated by those practices are 9,700 acres, and we need 6 million acres to be treated by those practices. So the context of that is that we need to install 1,200 bioreactors and saturated buffers every year for the next 100 years to reach the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy. And at the current pace of installation, it will take 1,000 years to get enough wetlands that we need. So, it's just the nutrient reduction strategy is just not realistic in saying that we're going to get to any of these goals just through voluntary measures alone. So I'll just end with a couple of solutions that we've proposed for Iowa's failed nutrient policy. We need to update our nutrient reduction strategy with benchmarks and an actual strategy. We need to require basic standards of care on farm ground, such as buffers. We need to limit fertilizer application, improve our monitoring, strengthen water quality standards, and strengthen regulations on concentrated animal feeding operations. So happy to talk about more of that in the Q&A, and I will end there.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you.
And just as if we weren't, I was going to say low enough, but if we haven't fully stewed in the context of what we were working with, let us add Matt Rota and a lower river perspective to this.
Hey, yeah, thanks. I don't have a presentation, so sorry, you're just gonna have to look at my face. Yeah, I'm Matt Rota. I'm the Senior Policy Director at Healthy Golf down in New Orleans, also known as Bolbonsha. And so we've been dealing with toxic algae blooms and harmful algae blooms for quite a while. One of the biggest things that we deal with is the dead zone that forms at the mouth of the Mississippi River that Dr. Gobler talked about briefly. It's all or very much due to runoff that's coming down the Mississippi River, the nitrogen phosphorus pollution getting down to the Mississippi River, causing algae blooms, which then end up dying, sinking to the bottom, eaten up by bacteria to cause that area in the bottom of the water to be low in oxygen. So critters either actually have to swim away or suffocate. And this year's dead zone was of middling size. It definitely wasn't near the biggest. It wasn't the smallest either. And the reason it was small-ish is because of the low flows in the Mississippi River. And it's not due to any actual action that's happened on the landscape at a scale that would impact our reduction of the size of the dead zone. And I think it's misleading whenever the folks that go out and measure it, they're great. But whenever the media folks at the corresponding agencies get their hands on, they say a smaller than average dead zone. Well, average is bad, and smaller than average is still bad. It's still well above what the goal is that scientists came up with back in the 90s about what we should be trying to do to what our goal should be to reduce the size of the dead zone. And I think that what we're going to be seeing with climate change is a greater fluctuation, probably, is when we have large rain events during like in April, May time, we're going to see larger dead zones. When we have droughts, we're going to see smaller dead zones, and we're in a drought right now, and we have been for several months, and that is manifesting down here. And I'm going on a slight tangent here, because it's a kind of immediate thing that's happening with the Mississippi River, due to the drought, we are seeing salt water creep up the Mississippi River. And it is up to mile 69, yay, in the river, which means it's already contaminated several drinking water intakes along the Mississippi River, where the salt water and the reason the salt water is pushing up is the Mississippi River is actually lower than the Gulf of Mexico because we dredge it. And recently, in the past 2 years, it was the Congress directed the Corps of Engineers to increase the draft of the Mississippi River in our area around New Orleans for the Port of New Orleans from 45 feet to 50 feet. And it was acknowledged by the Corps of Engineers that if we do that, we are going to see more saltwater intrusion. And that's indeed what we're seeing. The Corps of Engineers has put a sill on the Mississippi River, on the bottom of the Mississippi River, to prevent that wedge, or at least slow down that wedge. But people are already being impacted, can't drink their water. Their appliances are being corroded by the salt water. And we are in grave danger, especially as it moves up into areas that have older plumbing, for that salt water to corrode and activate and dissolve heavy metals such as lead. So we're under quite a bit of a threat here, and this is a climate change issue, because we're in an unprecedented drought. Well, not unprecedented, but a major drought. The people farthest down in the Mississippi River have been dealing with this saltwater wedge since June. So this has been going on for a long time. And it really only got into the news because white communities started getting hit, which is a sad fact of where the environmental racism that happens down here. And to tie it into the algae blooms and things like that, in pictures that I've seen over the river, I've never seen the Mississippi so green. And I don't know what kind of algae that is that's creeping up from the it's obviously saltwater based, because that's what's creeping up there. But we are seeing, and I haven't seen any indication of if that is impacting wildlife or anything like that, but we are seeing a much greener river. Even up in when I was down at the Mississippi on Sunday, it was definitely greener than I was used to, which was interesting. And as the ships went by, it kicked up green from the bottom. The saltwater wedge isn't supposed to get to New Orleans until the end of the month, but this is something that we need to get 10 inches of rain in the northern basin in order for the saltwater wedge to get pushed out. And that does not seem like there are any indications of that happening anytime soon. And so kind of the remediation things that are happening right now, we have a emergency declared by the state, and Biden declared an emergency yesterday afternoon for Louisiana. And so that's starting to mobilize. They're barging fresh water to impacted water treatment facilities that are experiencing it, basically to try to dilute the water to an acceptable salinity that shouldn't be harmful. But we are seeing disparities of what the water treatment facilities are claiming and what people are measuring at their taps. For New Orleans, it's a bigger thing. They're going to have to build a pipeline down from Baton Rouge or somewhere else, build a 70-mile pipeline in order to supply the city with fresh water, because it's the New Orleans East Bank facility is the largest water treatment facility. But I think that this again ties in to what Alicia and Dr. Gobler were talking about, is the kinds of changes that we're going to be seeing. And I think the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, to borrow from Dr. Gobler, is down here is the salt water. Is that we're seeing that saltwater intrusion really come up the Mississippi River. It's happened about every decade since the 80s. And it's happened last year and this year. That is not a pattern at this point, but it is certainly concerning. And I think as we move forward, is trying to figure out how we are going to adapt to these new circumstances. And from what Alicia was showing, we're adapting in the wrong direction. We're applying more fertilizer because the farmers are trying to adapt to a changing climate, but trying to keep their yields, which is causing more application of fertilizer, which flows down to us, which causes a bigger dead zone. And so I think it's real. And then the idea of deepening the Mississippi River, and Olivia, that's from 45 to 50 was you had a question. There's so 5 feet deeper, and that we're definitely prioritizing commerce over clean water, and that decision is being made without the input of people. And I think that's the same thing that's happening with the dead zone and pollution issues the other pollution issues that we're seeing, is that it is being done for industry, for industrial farms, for the shipping industry, and we are, one of the largest ports in the country, and if we shut down our port, we would go into some sort of collapse for the nation. But right now they're certainly not on even footing. The Corps of Engineers always tells me they have a three-pronged or a three-legged stool that they operate on. One is navigation, one is flood protection, and then the other is environment. But one of those, just like my fingers here, is a lot shorter than the others, and so we're not sitting on a very stable stool here. And it seems like climate change is going to be really accelerate that, and we're seeing it very quickly. And that's the most disturbing thing to me, is just what Dr. Gobler was showing, and what Alicia was showing, and what we're seeing down here is just how rapid some of these changes can happen. And so I think we need to be figuring out solutions both with adaptation and for ideally preventing the pollution in the first place.
Excellent. Thank you again, Professor Gobler, Alicia, and Matt. Let's do questions, and I have been collecting questions from the chat. If you didn't get a chance to write your question in the chat, go ahead and do that, or throw up your hand and we can call on you so you can speak to the group. But I will start with what was in the chat, and I think the first couple were for Dr. Gobler. So first was from Matt. Would it be fair to say that phosphorus drives the growth of microcystis, but nitrogen drives the toxicity?
Yeah, I think that it depends. That's a where and when question. So I think each ecosystem is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be the characteristics of the water body as well. Is it shallow? Is it deep? What are the nutrient sources? So, I mean, by and large, that's probably not a bad way to look at it. But, it's an ecosystem by ecosystem basis, and you certainly could find exceptions to that sort of paradigm.
And then second for you, Professor, have you looked at the issue of HABs increasing climate change through their production of methane?
I'm sure there is emerging evidence, and already evidence that these HABs can produce methane. I would say on a global basis, that's probably not a strong driver, but certainly we need to understand, because of the strength of methane, I think it's about 25 times stronger than CO2. It is important to understand all of those sources and to control them where we can.
And then finally, years ago, Lake Erie was declared dead. It came back. What are the chances that that can happen again?
Yeah, I'm an eternal optimist. I just came from a meeting that was local, that was all about turning around ecosystems, and I think essentially, whether you're dealing with a small lake like the meeting I was just in, or something as big as the Mississippi River, or as big as Lake Erie, I think it's just a matter of getting the stakeholders together and getting everybody on the same page, and being proactive, right? I mean, knowing that you've got to. Everybody's going to have to pull in the same direction for things to happen. And I'll just emphasize that one of the papers I put up makes a really important point of this, is that, with climate change coming, and already, as I showed, not just coming, it's already had an effect on those blooms that we're seeing. But knowing that, we're not, that's only going to intensify, it almost requires everyone to be doubling down on reducing nutrient loads, because the water bodies are going to be made even more vulnerable to these events because of impending temperature changes, maybe precipitation changes. And so we really need to put an even stronger effort in reducing nutrients, and like I said, that takes getting everybody on the same page.
It looks like, Matt, you responded to Olivia's question. I have a question, Professor Gobler, about are you aware of any similar to the work that you are doing on the East Coast, are you aware of any universities in the Mississippi River Basin that are kind of taking a look at this, or have you partnered with any folks here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have colleagues at the University of Tennessee and in Ohio, Toledo University, and there's a lot of efforts being made in understanding, these relations between nutrient loading, changes in temperature, intensity of blooms, relative importance of nitrogen and phosphorus. So it's an all hands on deck effort, and we need as many people as possible getting to the bottom of it, really, and finding solutions.
Great. Anyone for a last question before I share some final thoughts? My reporter colleagues, anybody? All righty. Well, this is a very good segue into, the idea of working together, singing from the same song sheet. I think Mary Ellen was requesting some talking points from Matt, and we have opportunities to do that. So two questions that MRN, Mississippi River Network, we are asking and thinking about. One is to gather as many resources as we have to share with our grassroots supporters, with our grass top supporters, resources that exist in our states to monitor harmful algal blooms, other closures, things that impact all of our states every summer, and make a sort of educational one-stop shop somewhere on our website in the future, so folks can be aware of what's going on. Similar to, Alicia shared a great example of what they're working on in Iowa with the Iowa Water Watch. So what else do you all use, and what are you aware of, or what's missing? What are the gaps? And then finally, I think all of our speakers kind of referenced variously the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force. I think there may be some state DNRs and EPA folks here that participate and make up the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force. We, as the public, have an opportunity to engage with them directly at their annual meeting, which is occurring on December 6th in Fayetteville, Arkansas. There will be both a virtual and in-person component. In years past, both Matt, Alicia, and myself, we've submitted public comments. We would love to coordinate comments not only with organizations, but also with any of you all that are on as individuals, members of the public who have experienced some of these impacts and want to know more or want to share more about how we can be doing things differently. So if you would like to engage on either of these things, please let me know. For my task force or agency folks, we're really looking forward to working with you on these, and I'm just sharing my contact information. I will share Alicia, Matt, and Professor Gobler's if that's okay with them as well. And I think that is our message here. We think we ought to be looking at the whole river together, and this is a step in that direction. So appreciate everyone taking the time to be here. We will send follow-up via email, but with that, I will wish you all a great rest of your Thursday and see you next time. Thank you.